Welcome to this edition of IBFD's Tax Takes, News and Views, bringing you the week's tax news in a nutshell. I'm Barry Larking, Special Counsel at IBFD, and with me for our Beyond the News interview is Stuart Gibson, IBFD's Chief Editor, Global News in Washington, D.C. On today's show, the EU ups the pressure for getting global consensus on digital tax. Africa kicks off its Continental trade deal as Britain and the US are still thinking about theirs. And the EU Court of Justice rules that tax motive alone cannot justify Sweden's anti-base erosion rules. These and more coming up on IBFD's Tax Takes, including Stuart Gibson's interview with Sandra Hazan, partner and head of the Europe Tax Group at Dentons in Paris, on the prospects for an entente cordiale between France and the Biden administration, at least on the tax and tariffs front. First, we turn to the top news of the past week as reported in IBFD's Tax News Service. While the OECD tries to find common ground in 3,500 pages of public comments on its global tax reform blueprints, the EU is stepping up the pressure by releasing its own public consultation on digital taxation. The EU has repeatedly said that it will introduce its own digital tax rules if no consensus is reached on the OECD's global proposals. But it's now clear that the EU could impose its own digital levy or levies in addition to any taxes that are agreed at the global level. The idea is that the revenues would benefit the EU as a whole rather than just EU member states' own treasuries, and will help finance the EU's massive economic recovery plans and borrowing programme. But as Professor van Istendal pointed out in our Tax Takes interview last week, it may be an uphill struggle to get the necessary political backing for these new EU-level taxes, even if the cause is a noble one. The EU has scheduled two consultations running through February 11 and April 12, respectively. As many countries continue to postpone tax payment and reporting deadlines in response to the health and economic crisis, both Italy and Spain have postponed the deadlines to report and pay their respective digital services taxes. Spain did the same for its financial transaction tax, while Italy actually postponed the introduction of a national plastics tax and a tax on sweet drinks. Among the many other initiatives to address the crisis, Denmark plans to make interest-free loans to small businesses to finance certain employee taxes. But unlike in the United States, where such loans can be forgiven, the Danish loans must be repaid by November. While post-Brexit Britain searches for new trade partners and the new US administration reviews existing trade relations, 54 African nations have begun a new continent-wide preferential trade regime called the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. Although the COVID pandemic had delayed the agreement's kick-off and some countries may lack the infrastructure to take advantage of the new arrangement, Ghana, Egypt, South Africa and Rwanda have already started to trade under its terms. And as the Secretary General of the new bloc aptly put it, market integration is a process. Despite the crisis, or perhaps in response to it, countries continue to address tax evasion and tax avoidance. While Jamaica has now implemented the global standard on exchanging information on financial accounts, Luxembourg has tightened up its equivalent rules by requiring nil or zero reporting from financial institutions. And just to show that the EU and its member states are not the only ones with blacklists, Uruguay has just updated its own list of low or no tax jurisdictions, bringing the total to 39. Anti-avoidance measures sometimes don't work as well as they might, at least in the EU, as the latest decision from the EU's Court of Justice shows. The EU Court has just struck down former Swedish rules that denied a tax deduction for interest paid to a foreign group company if the principal reason for the payment was to obtain a significant tax benefit. The decision brings to mind the famous UK court ruling in the Duke of Westminster case some 100 years ago that every man is entitled, if he can, to order his affairs so that the tax is less than it otherwise would be. It seems that the Duke's spirit lives on, at least in the EU. Talking of tax-motivated arrangements, Germany and the UK have agreed to amend their tax treaty, primarily to introduce some of the BEPS anti-avoidance provisions, such as the principal purpose test. At the same time, the two countries agreed to make further changes to the treaty in the near future. This side agreement may turn out to be even more significant than the anti-avoidance changes if it means companies can be sure that no German tax will be withheld on dividends paid to UK parents post-Brexit. Watch this space. And now moving on to other news. Poland has just made it less attractive for Polish workers to work outside the country by largely replacing the current exemption method with a tax credit method. Russians who own a controlled foreign company now have the option to pay tax on a fixed amount rather than on the foreign company's actual profits. As the fixed amount of the foreign profit starts at around 400,000 euros, it looks like the benefit will be limited. Demonstrating how creative tax relief can be, Panama now gives food providers a tax credit for the discounts they are required by law to give to elderly customers. Why the discounts are given to women over the age of 55 and only to men over 60 is a mystery. And finally, Spain has extended by 3 days the filing deadlines for individuals affected by the recent snowstorm Filomena. Hopefully this does not reflect how long the average Spanish taxpayer was stuck in the snow. And now we go beyond the news for Stuart Gibson's interview with Sandra Hazan. Stuart.
Thank you, Barry, for your informative news report. I'm Stuart Gibson, Chief Editor of Global News here at IBFD. I'm joined today by Sandra Hazan, Partner and Head of the Europe Tax Group in the Paris office of Dentons. Welcome, Sandra.
Thank you, Stu.
So good to see you. Sandra, before we get into the discussion, could you please briefly share with our viewers the nature of your practice at Dentons?
Certainly. I'm a tax lawyer sitting in the Paris office. I'm responsible for the European tax group at Dentons. I'm also co-chairing the global tax group. My practice is mostly focused on dispute resolution and litigation in taxes, particularly in transfer pricing arena. Most of my clients are in the luxury industry, be they French or Italian, for example. So of course, transfer pricing has always been key in their day-to-day practice of transfer pricing.
So your clients have a direct stake in what's been going on recently between France and the United States.
Absolutely.
So a lot has happened over the last 2 years as the OECD has tackled, in the language of BEPS Action 1, the tax challenges arising from digitalization. Could you please tell us where things now stand on the project, particularly as they relate to the relationship between France and the United States?
Well, on the project itself, the OECD and the J20 inclusive framework had agreed to present the final design of the Pillar 1 by July 1st of 2021. In the meantime, they issued a blueprint in October 2020 and an online public consultation that was held in January, earlier this month. Now, what I know is that many have been calling for greater simplification to reduce complexity and compliance cost. And given the political priority of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, we all expect and hope that the joint efforts will be concluded this year.
So, as you know, there has been a lot of tension over the last year or two between France and the United States, particularly as it relates to the French DST, which was suspended for a while, and former President Trump's decision to impose large tariffs on the importation of French luxury goods. So at the end of the year, right before President Biden took office, the outgoing administration decided not to impose retaliatory tariffs on the importation of French luxury goods, despite France's decision to resume collecting the DST last December, and the U.S. is finding that the French DST unfairly discriminates against the United States. I should add parenthetically that the trade representative found that a whole bunch of other countries' DSTs also discriminated against the U.S. What might these series of developments over the last 6 weeks mean for the future of French-U.S. trade relations?
Well, we do have very high hopes here in France that the U.S. approach will be completely shifting from what it was under the Trump administration. There are already some very clear signs that a new understanding of what France has been trying to achieve over the past few years, since 2019, actually, in the very first J20, France has been at the forefront of the battle against tax evasion, where the GAFAs were particularly held responsible. So the French have decided to freeze their DST collection until last December, but they have, as you said correctly, resumed on this. But there are now talks which are supposed to be taking place fairly soon in order to get a deal for the summer of this year.
And just for our viewers who are not familiar with all the acronyms, GAFA stands for Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, right?
Correct.
The big four digital retailers and digital platform hosts. So a number of high-ranking officials in Europe, including French Finance Minister Le Maire and German Finance Minister Scholz, have signaled that if no agreement is reached by this summer on a global solution to taxation of the digital economy, they will either adopt or, as in the case of France and the UK, will make permanent their existing, quote, temporary DSTs. On the other hand, Monsieur Le Maire reacted positively to some of the recent remarks of incoming U.S. Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen, particularly on the subject of taxation of the GAFA. As we record this interview, we're only 5 days into the newly installed Biden administration. Most of his cabinet have not been confirmed yet, although we expect a positive vote on Secretary Yellen today. President Biden has not yet identified the people who are going to lead our country's efforts to reach consensus on global tax reform, the successors to Chip Harter and Bob Stack. And with the pandemic infecting and killing record numbers of Americans and Europeans around the world every day, global tax reform is nowhere near the top of President Biden's agenda. In your opinion, in these circumstances, how realistic is it for the rest of the world to expect action from the U.S. on such a consequential initiative within such a short time frame? And would you expect some slippage of this deadline?
It's very difficult to say. The only thing I can say is that France has not been waiting actually for the DST to tackle tax evasion. And France had actually a wide range now of weapons to tackle the GAFAs. In particular, because we always focus on the DST, but eventually the DST in terms of budget and earnings for the French Treasury do not exceed 350 million euros, which is very, very low. And it is by no way proportionate to what could be expected. In terms of implementing action and fight against evasion, the French actually, as I mentioned, have a number of weapons. Some of them arise out of the latest legislation on the criminalization of tax evasion. In particular, since 2018, there is a way for the French authorities to require criminal prosecutions. And you may have heard about the Google case, where Google was successful before the first court and then the Court of Appeal, defending that it had no permanent establishment in France via its French affiliate company. And despite this victory, the French authorities have decided to take a different approach and attack Google under the angle of a more straightforward, more standard discussion about the level of profits that were earned by the French company, the French Google company. And instead of focusing on permanent establishment justification, which is extremely factually related and sometimes difficult to substantiate, they have decided to take, as I mentioned, a straightforward route about transfer pricing. Under the new legislation, if the transfer pricing adjustments are made with penalties, 2 times 40% penalties, the prosecutor will be immediately alerted and will take action. And this is how Google has accepted to sign an agreement with the French authorities to avoid criminal prosecutions for its representatives, and has accepted to pay 1 billion euros. So this is definitely one of the most effective ways that the French authorities do have to tackle this type of situation. Very recently also, the Supreme Tax Court has really opened a new way to the French authorities by taking a far more pragmatic approach of what a permanent establishment can be. We had a landmark decision on December 11 of 2020 regarding the firm Conversant, which was more or less in a very similar situation to Google, with an Irish company, a license in place, and a small entity rendering marketing, so-called marketing services, which were only being compensated on the basis of a cost plus 8% markup. So very similar circumstances as compared to Google. And in that particular case, the Supreme Court took a very pragmatic approach, and they no longer considered whether the authority to conclude contracts was being materialized. They just looked at the facts and said, even if all the contracts with the ultimate clients were being signed in Ireland, this was just a formal blessing, and this was by no means reflecting the actual activity of the French company. So they considered that there was a permanent establishment. And now it leaves, of course, the big can of worms open, which is the attribution of profits to the permanent establishment. But at least the substantiation of permanent establishments has been really widened up by the Supreme Court with this landmark decision.
It sounds to me that from what you've just shared with us, that there might be an opportunity for the deadline, this July 1 deadline, to slip a little bit, seeing as France is already taking advantage of other tools in its toolbox to address the issues of base erosion and profit shifting, at least from companies that do business with French consumers.
Yes, the French have always made it very clear that they will not be waiting for the consensus, and that they will be taking active steps, and this is happening.
You see. So finally, and this is talk about can of worms, what do you think the rest of the world is expecting from the U.S. now that the Biden administration is taking office in the U.S.?
Well, I would tend to think that the hopes are very high that the US will now join the team of those who want to fight tax evasion. It's everyone's interest, rather than taking a very nationalistic approach as to US giants or not. The US is also a consumer, so it may have advantage also in considering that they may be unicorns in some other countries, and we do have a number of them in Europe. So it would be interesting that we take a win-win approach and with the US and having them really joining the team.
Well, it sounds like there's much food for thought there, that it's basically watch this space, and it seems to me that the European nations are optimistic that the U.S. will soon rejoin the OECD discussions once the right people are in place. Our guest today has been Sandra Hazan, partner and head of the Europe Tax Group in the Paris office of Dentons. Sandra, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us, and particularly the detail about the tax cases that the French government is using to address the entire subject of tax avoidance. And looks like we're in for a very eventful 2021.
Definitely. It's been my pleasure. Thank you, Stu.
That wraps up this week's edition of Tax Takes News and Views, the week's tax news in a nutshell. From Barry Larking and myself, thank you for watching. Here's hoping your week is not too taxing.